Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Zabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. Alright children, today is St. Stephen's Day, also known as Martymas, the day after Christmas. And so today we're going to do a special children's church history story about good King Wenceslas. So there is a Christmas carol known as Good King Wenceslas, which was written in the 1800s. And it tells the story of a king named Wenceslas, who was the king of Bohemia. So the carol about good King Wenceslas is that on the feast of Stephen, King Wenceslas was looking out of his castle and he saw out in the snow a poor peasant out there collecting firewood. And he calls to himself his little page boy to say, "Hey, do you know who that peasant is?" And the boy said, "Yeah, I know him. He lives quite a way away." And the king says, "Quick, let's get some meat and some wine and some good firewood, and we're going to go have a big feast with him tonight." And so they ran out into the snow to go help this peasant. And as they were going in the snow, it was too cold and strong for the page boy to keep up. And so the king instructs the boy to walk behind him, following in his footsteps, which will keep him warm and help him find his way. And then the final verse says that basically, just as this young boy followed in the footsteps of King Wenceslas, so too we Christians should follow the example of King Wenceslas and go and help the poor. Now, this carol is not a true story. This isn't actually a recorded story that ever happened. However, it is based on the very real, true King Wenceslas, or Duke Wenceslas, as we're going to discuss in a moment, and his actual works of charity. Let us study the actual history of good King Wenceslas. Because even though this Christmas carol isn't an actual story from his life, it does reflect the kind of things that Wenceslas did do in his lifetime. But in order to understand that, we need to begin with the life of King Wenceslas. Wenceslas was born in the year 907 AD. He was the grandson of Borevorge and Ludmilla, who were the Duke and Duchess of Bohemia, and they had been converted to Christianity from paganism by the Slavic missionaries Cyril and Methodius. And they had a son, Wenceslas, who had married a pagan princess. So Dromira was the daughter of a pagan chief, and she had agreed to convert to Christianity in order to marry the Prince of Bohemia, Wenceslas, Wenceslas's father. And so on their wedding day, Dromira was baptized and converted to Christianity. However, as we're going to learn, she was very much just a Christian in name only, and was very much still a pagan at heart. Because Wenceslas and Dromira had two sons, Wenceslas and Borislas. And Wenceslas's grandfather, Borodvorj, had died and passed on to heaven, and had passed on his crown to his son, Wenceslas. And then, in the year 921, Wenceslas died and passed on his crown to his older son, Wenceslas. Now, Wenceslas wasn't actually a king. He was the Duke of Bohemia. So he was good Duke Wenceslas. Now the problem was, he became Duke at the age of 13. He was but a boy. And so, according to the Bohemian laws, even though he was technically the Duke, he wasn't allowed to rule. And so instead, his grandmother, Ludmilla, she instead went about running the Duchy of Bohemia and was doing the active role of ruling. And Ludmilla was a very faithful Christian woman, having been converted by the missionaries Cyril and Methodius. And she encouraged her grandsons to follow Christianity and to be good Christian rulers. But Drahomira, even though she was a Christian in name, was still very much a pagan at heart, and she resented Ludmilla, and she tried to encourage her son Borislav to follow paganism instead of Christianity. And later that year, in the year 921, Drahomira, resenting Ludmilla so much, got some men to kill her. And with that, Drahomira became the ruler of Bohemia. As I said, technically Wenceslas, the rightful heir to the throne, was the ruler of Bohemia, but since he was not yet old enough to rule, his mother ruled in his place. And, as I said, she was a pagan at heart, and she hated Christianity. She was a wicked duchess. And she used her power to oppress the Christians and to fight against the Christians, to persecute the Christians of Bohemia and to suppress Christianity. But in 1925, on his 18th birthday, Wenceslas was now old enough to take full control of Bohemia. And along with some faithful Christian noblemen, they were able to depose Drahomira and banished her from Bohemia. However, Borislav had been corrupted by his mother and was very much a pagan as well. Seeking to keep the peace in their country, Wenceslas divided up the nation between himself and his brother. So Wenceslas would be in charge, but Borislav could also be somewhat in charge, and they would kind of rule Bohemia as co-rulers. Now, as for Wenceslas himself, he was a very good, noble Christian ruler. As I said earlier, the carol Good King Wenceslas is not a true story, but it is based on things that he did. Historians of that era recount how every night he would go out with one of his chamberlains, and he would go out every night visiting the sick and the widows and the orphans and those in prisons, taking them food and giving them firewood and looking after the poor and the oppressed in his territory. And so, even though the carol Good King Wenceslas is a made-up story, it's very likely that Wenceslas may have actually done something like that. And there's also another account that details what kind of a good king Wenceslas was. So the story goes that one of Wenceslas's counts, Radislas, decided to rebel against the Duke, and he led an army of others against Wenceslas. But when they met on the battlefield, seeking to avoid bloodshed, Wenceslas proposed to Radislas that they should handle the war between the two of them. That the two of them would have a one-on-one joust, and that's how they would decide the winner. And as the story goes, as Radislas was riding his horse towards Wenceslas, two angels appeared before Wenceslas, bidding him to stop. And seeing this, Radislas stopped his horse, jumped off, fell on his knees, and begged Wenceslas for forgiveness. Wenceslas humbly got off his horse, walked over to the man, told him to rise to his feet, embraced him, and forgave him. But sadly, despite all the good that Wenceslas had done in his life and during his rule, here's a very sad ending to his life. As I mentioned earlier, his brother Borislas had been corrupted by their mother to embrace paganism. And so, in the year 935, Borislav tricked Wenceslas. He invited him to come over to his place for a feast of one of the Christian saints. And as Wenceslas arrived, three noblemen who were loyal to Borislav attacked Wenceslas and started attacking him with their swords. And as Wenceslas was lying there, dying, his brother Borislav came out with a lance and finished off his brother. And so Wenceslas died as a martyr for the Christian faith. However, there is a slight upside to this story. After Borislav killed his brother, he was moved to the heart with remorse. He realized, oh no, I just killed my own beloved brother. And he became repentant and sorrowful over what he had done. And in that moment, Borislav realized that this paganism thing was not a good thing at all. That paganism was violent and wicked and evil and caused him to kill his brother. And so he denounced paganism. And as the legend goes, that very day that Borislav had killed Wenceslas, the wife of Borislav had given birth to a son. It is possible that maybe this birth is what encouraged Borislav to kill Wenceslas that day, knowing that he would have an heir to follow in his footsteps. But moved by remorse for what he had done, Borislav took his newborn son and he named him Straktvas, meaning dreadful feast, because of what had happened that day. And because he had killed his brother out of paganism, turning his back on God, and had done so to take the throne from his brother, he decided that his son would not ascend the throne, but that Strachwas would be dedicated to the church and would be raised to become a priest. And as for Wenceslas, as I mentioned earlier, he was not actually a king. Instead, he was the Duke of Bohemia. However, upon the death of Wenceslas, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I awarded to Wenceslas the title of King of Bohemia. And so, even though Wenceslas had never used the title of king in his life, in his death, he was now known as Good King Wenceslas. And that's our story for today, children. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.